right. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It is so good to be here with you. My name is Kent. If I haven't met you, I'm one of the directors here with the church. Every once in a while, I get to share. So real excited to do it this morning. If I haven't met you, really quick fun fact about me. I love to watch movies in my free time. And I've shared that before, but I wanted to share it again really so I can have an excuse to talk about Avengers Endgame. Did anybody see it and just love it? Yes, totally. I loved it too. My wife and I, we went and saw it pretty recently. And it was just like so good. Like we seriously enjoyed it. There may have been some tears. I won't say if they were from me or if they were from my wife. They were from me. But yeah, seriously loved it. And so for the week after seeing that movie, I spent like all this time looking up like interviews from the cast and looking up facts about the movie. And I actually found that it was the second highest grossing film of all time in terms of ticket sales, which is crazy. It sold over $2.5 billion of tickets worldwide, which is nuts. Yeah, I've got this chart here, and it's crazy. You can look at this, and all of the Avengers movies are in the top 5, and you've got all these other different superhero movies up there. And I was looking at it, and I was just like blown away as to why that would be, right? And I think it's because there's just something in us that longs for these stories about heroes. Right? There's something in us where we love these stories where, people's lives, they might be a little bit of a mess and they're not perfect, but we love stories where they pull it together and they do something in the end for the greater good. And I think we want to believe that something in us can aspire to be that way. We want to sort of find other people who are like that to sort of have as role models. But in real life, it's really, really rare to find people like this that actually live up to the title of hero. And so we look all over the place, right? We can look in music, politics, sports, like all these different areas. And occasionally someone will rise to the top. There'll be someone where it's like, okay, maybe this person is worthy of the title of hero, but it usually doesn't last very long. And so we're kind of just left waiting and looking around. And so if you've been with us, we're in this series, Hall of Faith. And really what we're doing in this series is we're looking at this list of people in the Bible that were really the heroes in Hebrew culture. And we find them in the book of Hebrews. They're literally in Hebrews 11. And what we found so far is that these people, their lives weren't perfect. They didn't have superpowers or anything like that, but they went down in history as people who are known for having this sort of heroic faith. Right? And so what our goal has been here as we've sort of been walking through this series is that we'll look at these people and we'll sort of imitate them, not so much because they're heroes in themselves, but more so for their faith. And this is where we find that it all sort of points us back to Jesus. And so it has been good sort of looking at their faith as a church. And faith, as we've seen, is one of those words that is kind of, it's become a little bit diluted in our culture. Right? It's a little bit hard to define. You can go to your local, Walmart or Hobby Lobby, and you can buy a piece of wood that says faith on it, right? So it's really easy to buy the word faith, but it's hard to define. And so in week 1, Brian spent some time sort of laying a foundation for us, and he defined faith basically as saying it's this internal belief with an external action. And he said that everyone has faith, right? Everyone's got it. The question is, where do you put it? And so we looked at that in week 1, and that was good. Last week 2, we got to hear from Matthew McClure, who's our new pastor here with the church, and that was really cool. And he introduced us to the first individual in the Hall of Faith, Abel. And so that was really good for him. We saw that the faith, it's not about just this external religiosity, but it's about the heart. And so that was good. Well, today, I'm literally just going to continue down the list. And we're going to look at the next individual in the Hall of Faith. And it's this guy who I think is everybody's favorite Bible hero, Enoch. Yeah. And you're laughing because Enoch, he's not very well known. I actually, when I found out that I was tasked with preaching on Enoch, I called a friend and sort of mentor back home. And I was like, hey, I'm getting this opportunity to preach on Enoch. And he was like, wow, what'd you do to deserve that? And I was like, oh my gosh, like it's pretty, harsh. But as I looked into it, I realized what he meant, because it's kind of surprising that he's in the Hall of Faith because there's so little written about him, right? We understand like Moses, he gets the entire book of Exodus, and you got Abraham, he gets a good chunk of Genesis, and he gets that song. If you grew up in church, Father Abraham had many sons had father. Yeah, I know the people who grew up in church now because they're laughing. But you get to Enoch, and he doesn't have any of that. There's no song that I'm aware of for Enoch. He just has 9 verses in the Bible. And so I've studied them, I've looked over them, and what I've found is that even though there's very little written about Enoch in the Bible, there's a whole lot that we can learn from this man. And so if you don't remember anything else I say this morning, remember this, it's the big idea. It's that faith is about desiring God above all else. Our faith, it's about desiring God above all else. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at sort of 3 things about Enoch's faith that sort of demonstrate or show how his desire was for God above all other things. And it's going to be good. But before we dive in and look at Enoch, let me just pray one more time for us, and then we'll get going. So Lord, just thank you again for bringing us here. Lord, thank you for that time of worship and for the stories of life change here in the church. Thank you for what you're doing. Father, we just ask that today as we open your word and we look at Enoch, that we could just see you. I pray that your voice would be the loudest one in the room. Amen. Okay, who is Enoch? Well, like I said, there's 9 verses in the Bible that talk about him. There's a couple genealogies. There's one in Luke 3 and one in 1 Chronicles. He makes an appearance in the book of Jude as sort of making this like prophecy of God's judgment, but scholars debate whether or not that was the same Enoch. So really, the bulk of the content that we have on Enoch comes from 2 places. It comes from Hebrews 11 and Genesis 5. And since we have time, I'm just going to read them both for us this morning. So if you want to follow along in your Bibles, you can mark out both of those spots, Hebrews 11 and Genesis 5. Or if you want, the verses will be on the screen as well, so you can follow along that way. But I'm going to start in Hebrews 11, starting in verse 5. It says, "By faith, Enoch was taken away, so he did not experience death. And he was not to be found because God took him away. For prior to his removal, he was approved since he had pleased God. Now, without faith, it's impossible to please God, for the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him." Well, there you go. It's kind of a quick note on Enoch, and I think it's quick because the Hebrews sort of already had an understanding of who Enoch was, and their understanding came from Genesis 5. So let's look there, starting in verse 21. We learn this. Enoch was 65 years old when he fathered Methuselah. And after the birth of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and fathered other sons and daughters. So Enoch's life lasted 365 years. Enoch walked with God, then he was not there because God took him. There you go. We're all experts on Enoch now. You've heard all that the Bible has to say pretty much about Enoch. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this up into 3 parts. I want to look at Enoch's long life, because that was interesting to see. I want to look at how Enoch lived life, because there was some repetition in there. And then finally, I want to look at this interesting way of how Enoch left life together. And like I said, from those 3 things, I'm going to pull out sort of these elements of Enoch's faith that show us that he desired God above all else. So it's going to be good. Point number 1, I just want to look at Enoch's long life. And it's kind of obvious, but like Enoch was old, right? Like he was really old. It's all fine and dandy at the beginning. It says he lived 65 years and he has a son with an awesome name, Methuselah. And then it keeps going though. And it says that he lived for 300 more years after that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, 300 years. If you've ever felt old, like this is insane. 300 years. And I was thinking about it and it's crazy. And a buddy of mine actually, who just became a Christian, started reading the Bible, and he started in Genesis. And when he got to Genesis 5, he gave me a call and he's like, bro, like, how are these people so old? And I'm like, bro, why are you starting in Genesis? Like, that's so hard. And obviously, the whole Bible is inspired. Like, we need to read Genesis and understand it, and that's great. But I just think it's more difficult to understand, especially at the beginning of your faith journey. So I looked into it for him, and I found that there's actually like a couple different views on Enoch's old age. One of them is literal, and it suggests that back then people just lived longer since the effects of sin were kind of still taking root in the culture, right? We're only a couple or a few hundred years outside of the fall. And so it says that people just lived longer back then. There's another view that's a little more symbolic, and it breaks apart all these different ages, and it says that they have meaning in that way. And there's Christians really on both sides of the spectrum. So I think it's important that we don't get too caught up in this debate, right? Because really, I think what we need to do, and this is a little bit of a bummer, I think we need to look at Enoch's age in the context of the whole genealogy. And that just sounds boring, right? Because we read the Bible and we get to those genealogies and we're like, oh yeah, and he fathered him and he fathered, okay, and we just kind of skip by it. But it's really, really important. We even need to look at those. And so what we find in this genealogy is that Enoch is the seventh son of Adam in the line of Seth, which directly paralleled this guy named Lamech. And Lamech was the seventh son of Adam as well, but in the line of Cain. And Lamech was just this intense, like, murderer. He was the first polygamist, so he had multiple wives. He actually wrote songs about how proud he was for having, like, murdered and slaughtered all of these people. And really, Lamech, like the way he lived was typical of the culture in Enoch's day. That people literally lived in open rebellion against God, and they're proud of it. And yet, in that verse in Hebrews, we see that Enoch was commended as one who had pleased God. So what do I want us to see then from Enoch's long life? I want us just to see that in spite of the cultural norm, Enoch lived to please God. He went against the flow of the culture, and he did it for a long time. He saw a lot, and he lived to please God. And this is just so rare today, because I think our tendency is to kind of like do what's comfortable, to kind of blend in, or even to just sort of please ourselves. But this isn't what Enoch did. He had just this laser focus on pleasing God. It almost makes me think of one of those like guards outside of Buckingham Palace that like you can like wave your hand in front of them and they're just not distracted. Like Enoch was like that, just so intent on pleasing God. And it makes me think of a friend of mine. His name is Sergio, and I met him as a freshman, as a student at BGSU. And, our relationship started out and we both were kind of like figuring out if like we were Christians and stuff. And are you a Christian? Are you? And it was like just sort of this interesting exchange. And so we found out that we were both Christians. And it turned out that we had a class together. And so day one of the class, the teacher had like sort of a get to know you game, as they usually do. And in this game, we had to write down our favorite book and share it with the class. And at the time, for me, my favorite book was literally the book of James from the Bible. But I was like, I don't think I want to write that down. Like, it just might be kind of a weird place to share that. And I don't want people to think like Christians only read the Bible. All Christians only like reading the Bible, because that's not true. And so I wrote down Wild at Heart as like my second choice. And so everybody starts to share, and people are going and sharing their favorite books. And Sergio gets up and shares before me. And I still remember he got up and he said, well, for my favorite book, I'd have to say that it's the Bible, but more specifically, the book of Hebrews, especially where it says, trust in the Lord your God and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. And I was like, wow, you know what I mean? He just didn't care what anyone thought. And it was really interesting. It had this ripple effect in class. Right? All of a sudden, all these other people started coming out of the woodwork and saying, actually, I really like to read the Bible too. And I like changed my answer and shared mine. But Sergio was just one of those guys who he just lived to please God. It was so evident in his life. Think about yourself in that type of a situation. Because I think for most of us, we're more like me, where we kind of like blend in, or we back off a little bit, right? We're more concerned with pleasing others, pleasing the culture, kind of fitting in, or just being comfortable. But Enoch's long life shows us that even amidst intense opposition, even in his old age, that true faith, it seeks to please God. So that's the first thing I want to see about how faith desires God above all else. The second thing that I want to look at is how Enoch lived life. Um, Back in the passage, it said, after the birth of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God, lived 300 years, fathered sons and daughters. So Enoch's life lasted 365 years. Then Enoch walked with God. And anytime you see repetition like that in the Bible, it's probably important. You want to take note of those things. And so scholars actually say that this is the most notable thing about Enoch's life. Above his old age, above everything else, it's just that Enoch walked with God. And this is a phrase that we're familiar with in churches. We're always asking each other, how's your walk with God, right? We ask it in groups, we ask it in our huddles at the well, how's your walk with God going? And I love that phrase, because walking implies movement. It implies putting one foot in front of the other. It implies that our faith goes beyond just meeting once a week and sitting in a pew stationary on Sundays. But I think we can be tempted to sort of compartmentalize our relationship with God a little bit, right? And we can just sort of limit him to once a week, or keep him only to these sort of religious moments. I actually have a friend who told me, or I heard from this friend, that he believed at one point in life that the pastor lived at his church. And I guess it's because there was a door behind the pulpit, and we've covered ours up, but there's a door here as well. But I guess the pastor would walk out of the door and would preach his message, and at the end he'd walk back out of the door. And so as a kid, this guy just sort of assumed, the pastor must live here, and he said that eventually he found out from his parents, or maybe he saw the pastor or something like that, oh my gosh, the pastor has a life. He actually gets outside of church and leaves. The pastor is not just confined to the church. Well, just like the pastor isn't confined to the church building, neither is God. He's always with us. He's everywhere, in the big things and the little things. In every situation, God is with us. The question is whether or not we'll acknowledge him wherever we are, right? And for me, what I've found is that I tend to acknowledge God a whole lot more when I'm in times of hardship and trial. And so another quick story, a thing that happened to me as a freshman, again, was I got diagnosed with this disease called UC. It's similar to Crohn's disease. And it was terrible. I was at St. Luke's Hospital for 3 weeks. So just a really long time I was there, and it was a really severe case. They actually said my colon might rupture, which could lead to real serious issues. And it was just so scary. And in that time, I prayed like crazy. God was just working in my life. People were coming in and praying with me, and I was praying, and I just felt this closeness with God, even amidst the hardship, right? But the scary thing is, I need God just as much when I'm healthy as I do when I'm sick and when things are rough, right? We need God so much more. But I think it's easy to kind of get sort of caught up in just managing all the blessings that God has given us, right? And I'm not saying that we need to when we acknowledge God, we need to be like these monks who just walk around and we're always somber and thinking about stuff. But I think what we need to do is we just need to invite God into every area of our lives. Think about your relationships. Is there a relationship that you haven't invited God into? Is there some area or event in your life that you don't acknowledge God in? Are there things in your life that you sort of push God out of and you check him at the door? Well, Enoch's life shows us that faith walks with God throughout all areas and all seasons of life. And so that's the second thing. We see that Enoch desires God. Faith desires God above all else. It walks with him through all areas of life. And the third thing, I want to look at how Enoch left life. And this is really interesting. You might have noticed it right as we read the passage. It says, by faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not experience death. And he was not to be found because God took him away. Let me first just acknowledge this is weird, right? It's okay to be honest in church. It says that he was taken away. Commentators say that the word that they use is that he was translated, which makes me think of a Star Trek, beam me up, Scotty. And he was just like from one place to another into God's presence, right? Just super strange. And I hear that and I'm like, if that's a possibility, like where can I sign up? That's the way that I want to go. But if you're thinking that, just to discourage you, there's only two people that's happened for in the Bible. We see that it happened for Enoch and for Elijah. Someone asked me, well, what about Jesus? Well, Jesus died and rose first before he was taken to be with God. So only two people. So probably not a great plan for us to make. It's probably not going to work out for you. But the scriptures say that it happened for Enoch. And so I looked into that because it's really kind of interesting. And there's, like anything else, a couple different views on it. Some people say that it foreshadows when Jesus returns, and so that the people who are still alive will go in the way of Enoch. And so that's one view. And there's another view that says, well, Enoch and Elijah, they just went in a special way because God had a special purpose for them. And they point to Revelation 11. There's these two witnesses that have a role in the end times. And they say, well, maybe that's Enoch and Elijah. And there's other views too. And there's Christians spread out on all these different views. And again, they're really interesting to look into, but we don't need to get too bogged down into it because there's something that's much more plain for us to see. And it's just that the way Enoch left life, it shows us that faith is rewarded with God's presence. The way Enoch left, it shows us that faith, it's rewarded with God's presence. And I shared this with a fellow staffer, and she said that word reward can be tough in our culture, right? Because it evokes images of the health, wealth, believe in God and he'll rain down money for you. You know what I mean? It makes us think of that, but that's not what's going on here in the passage. If you see, it says God rewarded Enoch with himself, with more of God. One of my favorite books is called With, and it's by this guy. His name's Sky Jathani, and he says the whole goal to life, the whole goal of the Christian journey is to just enjoy being with God. But oftentimes what we end up doing is we end up using God's as a means to some other end, right? It's not just about being with God. It's more about using God to get things that we want more than God. And there's lots of different ways that we do this, right? We can use God as a means to sort of gain moral authority, right? I follow the rules, other people don't. So God is a way that I become better than other people. We can use God as a way to gain popularity, right? I have this new purpose and look how great I am now. I already mentioned sort of the God as a divine vending machine view, right? Where if you just have enough faith, then and do that, then God's going to give you all of your heart's desires, health, wealth, prosperity, whatever it is. We can use God as a means to some other end. And I want to just clarify, it's good to ask God for things, right? God wants to bless us, and he really does give us a lot of things, but we should never allow the blessings to overshadow God as our true treasure. John Piper, who's a pastor, says it really well. And he says, Christ did not die to forgive sinners who go on treasuring anything above seeing and savoring God. And people who would be happy in heaven if Christ were not there will not be there. The gospel is not a way to get people to heaven. It's a way to get people to God. I just think that's incredible. Because heaven, we all probably long for heaven. Heaven is a really good thing. We should want that. But how much more should we want God himself? Is he your true treasure? The way Enoch left life shows us that faith is rewarded, and it's rewarded with God himself in this life and in the life to come. And so, quick clarifier. I think some of us hear that, and it doesn't sound like good news. It's a little bit disappointing. It's almost like God is the guy at a birthday party who forgot a gift, and so he puts a bow on himself, and he's like, I got you a gift. It's me. You know what I mean? And it's just that's kind of bums us out. But I think the reason that it does that is because we forget how good God is. Or maybe we just don't know how good God is, or we haven't heard about it. So I want to close in the same way that the author of Hebrews does. And I want to look at a verse that really just shows how good God is. And it's in Hebrews 12, verse 1. It says this: "Therefore, since we have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us," this hall of faith, "let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the source and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that lay before him endured a cross and despised the shame and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." So it says, therefore, right? Therefore, since we're surrounded by a great cloud of many witnesses, since we have this hall of faith, since we've seen Enoch's example, all these ways that he desires God above all else, since we've seen all that, he says, endure. The Hebrews were going through some difficult times. They had some things stolen from them probably, and they were being like shaken in their faith. And they're tempted to just like walk away, to stop gathering together, to stop worshiping, to just kind of live in a different way, maybe to go back to the old way, to Judaism. The author of Hebrews says, no, desire God above all else. Endure, keep meeting together, don't quit. And then he directs their attention to Jesus. He says it's all about Jesus. And here's what makes him so good. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. And that's so good because you know what the joy set before him was? It was you and it was me. And I know that because before creation, God was already at the right hand of the Father, right? So we know the joy set before him wasn't just going back to the right hand of the Father, right? Because then why descend at all? Why come down at all? Why go to the cross? It was because the joy set before him was it was you and it was me. The God of the universe wants to be in relationship with us. This was unheard of to the Hebrews. And this is the whole point of the book of Hebrews, right? We've got this hall of faith and we're looking at all these sort of heroes of the faith. The whole point is for him to say, hey, Jesus is better. Jesus is superior. He's greater than Moses. He's greater than the law. Jesus is greater than all of this stuff. And I think for us, we can forget that, right? Our faith can become mundane because we want all of these other things. And sometimes how good God is gets washed out in our desire for all these other things. So we don't desire him all that much. Or maybe you haven't placed your faith in Jesus and it's because you don't know how good he is. Listen, wherever you are this morning, I want you to know, like, God already desires you. He already desires us. So if you're here and there's even a part of you that wants this faith that desires God above all else, remember that God already desires you. Gaze at the cross, right? Jesus is literally crazy about us. Look to him. And so this morning, the invitation is that, like Enoch, right? God invites us to leave everything else behind and just to enjoy him, just to enjoy his presence, to literally know that he literally sings over you. In Zephaniah 3:19, it says that God sings over us in Christ, right? Romans 5:8, that God demonstrates his love for us, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. This is what makes him so good. We need to remember this and endure in our faith.